Good morning. Well, today's message is titled The Saga of the Magi and a Baby King. The Saga of the Magi and a Baby King. And as those of you here just heard, it comes from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. That's Matthew 2, 1 through 12. And thank you for reading that for us this morning. Before we jump into the text here in Matthew, I'm going to look just at a little bit of a background. And that background comes from the book of Numbers, of all places. In Numbers chapter 22, it is the account of Balak and Balaam. It is the story of Balak, the king of Moab, and he has watched Israel overcome their enemies, and now they are camping in the plains of Moab. It says beyond the Jordan, which would be on the east side of the Jordan, across from Jericho. This would be north a little bit of Jerusalem. Balak, Moab, and Midian were all terrified of Israel. So Balak calls upon Balaam and says, "Please come. We want you to curse this people. We want you to curse Israel." Well, God tells Balaam, don't go with them. Don't curse them, because this people is blessed. And so Balaam declines the invitation from Balak to curse them. But Balak sends additional people, more distinguished people, perhaps more gifts. He tells Balaam that he will honor him richly. In other words, give him lots of money and possessions, perhaps. He'll honor him richly to curse them. And so Balaam says, well, I can't do anything that God doesn't say to do, but let me go back to him and see what he says. I'll check with him a second time. At this point, God says, okay, fine, go, but only say what I tell you to say. The rest of Numbers chapter 22, Numbers 23, and the first part of Numbers 24, Balaam ends up blessing Israel 3 times rather than cursing them. And of course, Balak is furious. And Balaam leaves one more message before he heads home. And it's found in Numbers 24, verses 15 through 25. But listen to just a couple of these verses. Verses 15, 16, and 17. He says, "This is the message of Balaam, son of Beor, the message of the man whose eyes see clearly, the message of one who hears the words of God, who has knowledge from the Most High, and who sees a vision from the Almighty, one who bows down with his eyes wide open." And he says this, verse 17, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down the sons of Sheth." Did you catch that? Did I pause enough in the reading? A star from Judah, a scepter of Israel, a promise of a coming king. So let's look now at Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi, or astrologers. Some people called them magicians, wise men. Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the Magi come and they go to Jerusalem. And they are wise men, they are intelligent for sure, but they are astrologers. They have been gazing at the stars and they see a new star. And that caused them to travel. And they traveled to Jerusalem. They came from the east. We don't know exactly where they came from. Probably the Near East as opposed to the Far East. This would include perhaps a district of ancient Moab, of Persia. It would be perhaps modern day Iraq or Iran that they come out of. And they come to Jerusalem. Now, why Jerusalem? Why was the star? Why did it do what it did? I don't know. But they came to Jerusalem. It was the capital of Israel. And so it was most likely that this king would be found in Jerusalem. And indeed, Herod was found in Jerusalem. So they come to worship this king. We've seen his star. We've come to worship him. How do they know about the star? How do they know about this prophecy of this star that was to come, of the scepter? Well, I'll offer this as an explanation. Again, remember, we've said this many times, Judah was in captivity in Babylon for 70 years. And one of the men that was there was Daniel. And Daniel was a godly man. Daniel was known as a wise man. He had much wisdom. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 20, it says that as far as wisdom and understanding goes, the king found him 10 times better than the magicians and the conjurers of their own country. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 48, it says that Daniel was promoted and made ruler over Babylon. And he was made the chief prefect or manager over the wise men of Babylon. And then in Daniel chapter 9, verse 2, we learn this. Daniel was reading, and it said in the books, which included Jeremiah. He was reading in Jeremiah that they would be in captivity for 70 years. But the books he had with him would most likely have been the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or books or scrolls. That is the Old Testament writings. Perhaps some of the prophets were included. Prophets like Micah, Isaiah, that would have been long before their captivity. He had these books, which would have probably included the books of Numbers. And so it's not much of a stretch of the imagination that after Daniel was gone, someone in Persia had access to his possessions, and they probably studied the things that Daniel had with him. We do that today. If we consider somebody very wise, smart, we study them. We study their lives. We study their writings. We study the things that have influenced them. And so Daniel had these books, and these astrologers very well then could have been studying the book of Numbers, which had been written some 1,500 years before Christ. I mean, 1,500 years. Abraham only had to wait 25 years for his son to be born. Some 1,500 years this had been written. So the Magi come to Jerusalem to worship the King. As we were already asked, did we come to worship today? Did we come with joy? Herod, in verse 3, when he heard this, when he heard that the Magi came to worship this newborn king, it says that he was troubled or greatly disturbed. He was mentally disturbed. He was agitated. I doubt that any king or anyone in a position of power wants to hear that their replacement has just been born or has just come on the scene. Verse 3 continues and says that all Jerusalem was troubled. Now, it is most likely that by all Jerusalem, it means especially the religious leaders, those that perhaps heard that there is this new king that was born. Partly because, well, how could these Gentile people, these strangers, how could they know more about their law than they do? How could they know about the Messiah? Look there at verse 4 then. Matthew 2, verse 4. So, gathering together all the chief priests, this is Herod, gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them, where is the Messiah supposed to be born? Now, the chief priests, these were the heads of the 24 divisions of the Levites, and it included the high priest. In Luke 1, Zechariah is part of the division of Abijah. He is part of one of these 24 divisions. The chief priests were the heads of this 24 divisions. They were primarily in charge of the temple and the temple worship and the things that needed to be done at the temple. The scribes, on the other hand, the scribes were in charge of the law. They were teachers of the law. They were scholars. They made sure people obeyed the law. And so Herod goes to the priests and the Pharisees. The Pharisees primarily were the scribes. So he goes to the priests and the Pharisees and he says, where's the Messiah going to be born? Verse 5, and they answered, in Bethlehem. That is what is written of the prophet. And the prophet here this time means not Isaiah, but Micah. Comes out of Micah chapter 5, verse 2, and primarily is quoted here in Matthew. But I'm going to read the verse from Micah, verse 2, 5:2. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Israel's coming ruler, born in Bethlehem, is from eternity past. He is deity. He is God. Well, again, take notice that in verse 3, everyone, it says, is troubled, or at least the religious leadership. Everyone is troubled, and yet they evidently aren't troubled enough to do anything about it. Because as the Magi begin to leave, no one goes with them. There is no evidence that anyone traveled with them to Bethlehem. They traveled alone. And we'll see that here in a moment. But there is no indication that the chief priests were concerned about this new birth in Bethlehem. They knew the scriptures. They knew the prophecies. They were intelligent. Perhaps they were just too arrogant to think these Gentiles knew what they were talking about. Perhaps they didn't have any real understanding. Perhaps they just didn't have faith. In any case, in verse 7, it says that Herod secretly called the Magi to himself. Secretly. He didn't want the chief priests there. He didn't want the scribes with him. He just wanted to give the Magi a message. He wanted to ascertain exactly when that star first appeared. When did you first see that star? And we don't know exactly the answer. But if you look ahead in the text to verse 16, when the Magi leave after talking to him, and after the Magi return home, in verse 16 it says, of course, Herod was livid. He was very upset. And so he had all the male children in the vicinity of Bethlehem. He had all of them killed from 2 years old and under. And so that was according to the time that the Magi said the star had first appeared. Therefore, it is most likely that the Magi first saw the star somewhere between 18, 20 months, 22 months earlier. Herod probably included 2 years to make sure that he got all the births that would have covered the time frame. But back in verse 8, the evil, manipulative, and cunning Herod sends the Magi to Bethlehem and says, search for him diligently. You find him. And when you find him, come tell me, because I want to worship him too. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Well, the Magi head to Bethlehem. This is approximately 5 miles to the south of Jerusalem. 5 miles south. Not a great distance at this point. It would be similar to Fredericksburg to Holmesville. It would be very similar from the Calf Barn to Holmesville. Or from the church here, maybe down to Mama's Diner. Right? Somewhere in that kind of vicinity. 5 miles. It's really not all that far considering how far they've come. Again, we don't know exactly where they came from, but it was easily anywhere from 500 to 750 miles. Now they only have a short 5 miles to go. Verse 9. The star, which they had seen in the east, shows up and goes before them until it stood over the place where Jesus was located. It seems in the text that this star reappeared to them in some way and led them on into Bethlehem. What was the star? What was this star? Was it an actual physical star that began at a point in time? Was it the glory of the Lord? Was it the light from the Holy Spirit? There have been many explanations and speculations over the years what the star is. But even in January of this year, astronomers still believe that the Milky Way produces roughly 7 new stars every year. 7. So, stars, are they still being born? Isaiah 9:2 says that people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in the dark land, the light will shine upon them. I tend to believe that this was an actual star that was created to indicate the birth of Christ. The Magi saw it, evidently recognized it from the studies that they had done. They recognized it as a fulfillment of some sort of prophecy, whether that was exactly Numbers 24:17 or not. They recognized it as a star for a new king. And they came to worship the king. And when they finally arrived in Bethlehem, it stood over the house where Jesus was. Did the star come down out of the sky? Was it up and just standing still? Maybe. I picture it this way. Have you ever been driving and on a very bright night, the moon just seems to follow, or you're following the moon? And it's there, and it just keeps going either before you or beside you. One specific picture that comes to mind is as I came up over a crest on the highway out in Chicago. The moon just huge over the skyscrapers, and it just seemed to sit there. And so, what did this star do? Was it in the sky, and as they approached the house, the angle, it just stayed there? Was it down close to earth? I don't know. But I believe that star led them to that doorway, and they enter. They enter the house. They can't believe it. I mean, their voyage is finally successful. I mean, this miracle has taken place in whatever the star actually was. And it led them to that door. Well, Matthew chapter 2, verse 10, it says that when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy, an abundance of joy. I mean, they are ecstatic. They have traveled hundreds of miles, probably taken several months to arrive in Bethlehem. And seeing the star just over the house where they knew Jesus was going to be inside, this child king, they rejoiced exceedingly. They were overwhelmed with intense emotions and joy. Back to the question earlier, did we come today with that kind of joy? Well, their trip was successful. Look at verse 11. They entered the house and they saw the child, Jesus. They saw the child with his mother Mary, and they fell to the ground. This was not, they didn't just kneel down. They fell, they prostrated themselves. They bowed their heads down, probably with their arms out so they could bow as low as they could. I don't know if you remember the days when we used to turn around in our pews and get on our knees and prostrate ourselves and put our heads down on the pew and pray. Something like that. They didn't just kneel down and say, "Oh, hi there, little boy, how are you?" They bowed and worshiped. They bowed and worshiped. They have found this king that was prophesied to the nations. They opened up their belongings, their travel bags, and they opened up their treasures, and they gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, gifts that are fit for a king, expensive gifts that are given to a king. I can't imagine what Mary is thinking. It doesn't say. What on earth is going on? I mean, what is her? She is probably shocked, surprised, thrilled. I don't know. You know, what elaborate gifts for my little boy. She's probably, if she got married at 13, she's probably 16 years old or so. What are these guys giving my son? They didn't come from a wealthy family. We know that because in Luke chapter 2, what it says. When Mary and Joseph took Jesus to the temple for his circumcision, He was circumcised on day 8, and then after her time of purification, which I believe was 32 or 33 days, then they brought the sacrifice that was required of them in Leviticus. And Leviticus chapter 12, verses 6 through 8 says that after a birth, the mother is to bring one of the following combinations: either a lamb with a turtle dove or pigeon, or if they could not afford a lamb, they were to bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. Well, according to the text in chapter 2 of Luke, Mary and Joseph evidently brought either 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. Evidently, they could not afford the lamb. And you can see that in Luke 2, verse 24. The Magi gave extremely valuable gifts for this little family. I imagine Mary was quite overwhelmed. And the narrative ends in verse 12. God warned the Magi in a dream not to return to Herod, and so they headed back to their own country using a different route. The Magi actively went searching for the King of the Jews, for this king. The Magi fell to their knees and prostrated themselves, worshipped him when they found him. The Magi gave gifts to him, and not just gifts, but valuable gifts of their greatest treasures. And then the Magi obeyed God for their successful return home. What did they receive through all this? Great joy. They rejoiced exceedingly. I think the challenge to us today is to be more like the Magi that went actively searching for the face of our Lord and Savior. To be like them that looked into his face, peered into his eyes, worshiped him. Did we come with joy? Did we come to worship? And to give of our most valuable assets to him. Is that our time, money, our talents? Maybe yes to all 3 of those. And then to be obedient in whatever he calls us to do. He is our king. It would do us well to treat him as such. I've heard people say, the wise still seek him. The wise still seek him. For the Magi, it was probably a one-time event. So unlike the Magi, let's not seek him just once. We seek him daily, continually. You know, we don't eat a meal today with the expectation that we're never going to eat again. What fun would that be? We don't drink water today thinking, oh, we're not going to ever drink water again. I got my water in now. We have to eat and drink every day to sustain our physical life. The wise still seek him over and over and over. From Isaiah 9. For the people in darkness, those of us that are Gentiles, the people in darkness will see a great light. He will increase our gladness, and we will be glad in his presence.